You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
It's almost a given these days that standing militaries are something states need, that it's a natural order of things that there is a professional military ready to do a state's bidding. But it's not actually something that's existed always throughout history or through states. We know that once professional armies happened in the Roman Republic, we started to see the decline of the Roman Republic and the onset of the imperial age. We also know that around Clausewitz's time, Napoleon's professionalisation and levée en masse changed the way people saw their militaries. The professional officers started to become important. But is a professional standing military something that a state needs? Or is it something that a state has and has to use? G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, Mick, and I'm the only host I know of a podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker, although it probably won't be long before someone comes and knocks me off the perch with Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, or maybe someone goes completely different, goes for the Swiss and goes for Jomini. That would be quite sad. Now, thanks to everyone who's joined the TDP community. That's our bespoke social media network that people can sign up to, and we can have some great conversations. We had a writing discussion, actually, just this past week where we talked about William Zinsser's On Writing Well. It's a great book. Everyone should read it if you intend on writing. And just quietly, if you text on your phone, then you probably want to read a little bit of Zinsser. All right, now before we get into today's show, I just wanted to let everyone know that the studio that produces this show has another production. Now, we try not to talk about War for Idiots on this show, and that's all I'll say about that show. However, there's another production out that has nothing to do with war and warfare. It's actually about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's hosted by Rich, who is from that other show I won't mention again, and it's really, really, really good, actually. I wouldn't say it's better than this show, but it is also near award-winning, I would suggest. Check it out. It's at Behind the Black Belt on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. In fact, it's on every pod channel you can. So it's another one from TDP Studios. Now let's get into it. Let's talk about my guest today. Maybe he knows a little bit about the utility of standing militaries and what happens when you have them. My guest today is Dr. Ned Dobos. Ned holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Melbourne and joined UNSW Canberra in 2012. He has held visiting fellowships at the Oxford Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics, Macmillan Centre for International Studies at Yale, the McCoy Centre for Ethics at Stanford, and the Philosophy Department at Georgetown University. Just some small schools no one's ever heard of. Ned specialises in the morality of war and political violence, with particular interests in armed humanitarian intervention, the workplace rights of soldiers, pacifism, and military abolitionism. He is also the author of two books, Insurrection and Intervention, that's by Cambridge University Press in 2012, and Ethics, Security and the War Machine, that's Oxford University Press 2020, and a great reference I used to structure this interview. He's also an Associate Director of the International Society for Military Ethics, Asia Pacific chapter, and co-edits the Current Perspective section of the Australian Journal of Human Rights. Most importantly, he was my Morality and Ethics in International Violence lecturer during my postgraduate degree. So that's probably his career highlight. Ned, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mick. It's a terrific podcast. You've had some really impressive guests in the past, so I'm flattered to have been invited into that company.
Yeah, and don't forget we've also had some guests that weren't that impressive, but that's okay. I guess you can't say that, I can. Now, before we start discussing ethics, security and the war machine, I'm actually keen to hear about how you became interested in studying military ethics.
I was an undergraduate art student at the University of Melbourne when the September 11 attacks happened. I was a philosophy major, so I was just starting to get a taste for nitpicky conceptual analysis and drawing these precise distinctions. So not too long after the attacks happened, I came across this report in the newspaper which had a quote from bin Laden where he said something like this: a terrorist attack is an attack on innocent people, but all those people, all those workers in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, they aren't innocent people. They contribute to the American government's crimes against Muslims. They vote for their government, pay their taxes, implement its policies, and so on and so forth. So they are involved in their country's oppression of the Islamic world. Therefore, these people aren't innocent bystanders, and so it's not terrorism, properly speaking. That's the kind of thing he was saying. And that got me thinking, although we all talk about innocent civilians being killed during armed conflict, and we all talk about terrorism, we might not agree on what an innocent civilian is, and therefore we might not agree on what is and what is not a terrorist act. So all this bounced around in my head for a couple of years while I was reading, French existentialist philosophy, and then I got invited to do an honours thesis. So I made this my question: are the tax-paying voters of a liberal democracy innocent civilians in war or not? That was my first major research project in philosophy, happened to be on military ethics, broadly construed. But after that, one thing leads to another, because in the course of that research, I came across so many other interesting questions that I'm pursuing to this day.
Wow, it's quite genius. Very interesting. This kind of ages you, because I was doing my undergraduate at where you currently teach at UNSW Canberra when September 11 happened. I kind of just didn't inform my studies at all. I just kept trying to pick the easiest subjects I could. But it's interesting to see how far it's taken you in your career, and noting that was nearly 20 years ago that attack happened. And now you've recently released a book, and I mentioned it before when I mentioned both of your books. And this book discusses the ethical dilemma in maintaining large standing militaries, which I awkwardly tried to do at the start before the intro, but I don't know if the listeners got it. So that's what this book's about, and that's kind of what we're discussing tonight: is maintaining large standing militaries. Now, are you able to provide our listeners with a bit of a rundown of like the premise of your book?
Sure. So we tend to assume that if it's ethically justifiable for a country to wage war under certain circumstances, then it must be justifiable for that country to prepare for war by creating and maintaining a military establishment. The first point that I try to really drive home in the book is that the reasoning here is faulty, or it's too quick, at least. So just because it would be morally permissible for me to do X under certain circumstances, that doesn't guarantee that it is permissible for me right now to acquire the means to do X. Further argumentation is needed to reach that conclusion. You might think of it this way. I can imagine a scenario where I might need a semi-automatic assault weapon to defend myself. If there's a large group of attackers, the local gang, or a stampede of wild animals or whatever. But that by itself isn't enough to justify me in keeping an assault weapon in the home. There are other considerations that need to be taken into account first, including all of the risks and dangers that I impose by keeping an assault weapon in the home. Once we take all of these other things into consideration, it might turn out that actually the reasons against my owning an assault weapon outweigh the reasons in favor. So I wouldn't be justified in owning an assault weapon, despite the fact that I might one day need it for self-defense, right? So I'd be justified in using it if I had it, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm justified in having it. There's a logical gap between these two propositions, and that's where I start. The same goes for militaries. I agree that there are circumstances under which the use of military force is justifiable. I'm no pacifist in that sense, but admitting this doesn't commit you to the conclusion that every state is justified in creating and maintaining a military, an institution that is devoted to war making. Again, there are all sorts of other things that need to be taken into account here. Militaries are very costly institutions, not to mention dangerous, just like assault weapons are. And when I say they're costly, I'm not only talking about the financial costs, there are moral and cultural costs as well. So really what the book does is It sets out the various costs and risks associated with having a professional standing army, which need to be taken into account when determining whether any particular country should have a standing army. Even after taking all of these things into account, let me be clear, some countries might still be justified in keeping a military, all things considered.
Mm-hmm.
But other countries might not be. And that's really the point here. It's an open question, and it should be treated as such. Whether a country should have a standing army, it's not a no-brainer. It's not a question that you can answer simply by making the inane observation that, well, one day you might need a military to defend yourself against attack. There's so much more to consider. And my book is trying to consider all of that other stuff.
It's interesting because my garden shed is full of things that I may need one day, but I often get criticised by other family members on whether or not I need to keep them. I'm glad you used the assault weapon analogy because my American listeners have copped it quite a bit because of where I stand on gun reform, both in Australia and the US. And I'm glad of the example that you used because nowhere in your example did you say that a peaceful protest marching past someone's house is a justifiable reason for owning and brandishing an assault rifle. So that's good because we've seen some pretty interesting things happening lately. But that's probably a little bit off topic. So I'll get back to the topic because I'm fascinated about this idea of the open question. And on the show, we love open questions. We try to write open questions and use open questions in our interviews. But also our mission is the eternal open question of defining war, right? So open questions kind of really buzz us here on the show. So let's talk about some of those other costs apart from the financial cost, because in Australia the financial cost is quite popular, particularly with 270 billion for the next decade being spent on defence in Australia. And I note that you had an editorial recently that was quite interesting on that. So I encourage listeners to go read Ned's editorial in the Canberra Times on defence spending. But let's get to the other costs, the costs that people aren't talking about as much, which are just as important. So in the book you discuss military conditioning and moral damage. These are quite fascinating concepts that I don't think everyone's familiar with. So are you able to explain these terms and explain why they are important in this context?
Good, sure. So about a month ago, I was listening to this very show, and you had my colleague on the program, Dean Peter Baker, and he was talking about moral injury. He's got a new book addressing it. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but if it's not, it's coming soon. Mm-hmm. During the conversation, Dean used this expression, moral numbing. I use the expressions moral damage and moral degradation, but we're really talking about essentially the same thing, and it's simply this. It's when soldiers become desensitized, right? So for a normal, morally healthy person, killing or maiming someone would be an emotionally distressing experience. Even if the killing is justified, even if it's in self-defense, say, if you're of good moral character, it would still be a deeply troubling experience for you to take somebody's life. But in war, soldiers can lose this moral sensitivity, which is understandable. If you're surrounded by lethal violence for a prolonged period of time, you're going to psychologically adapt to your environment and you're going to become morally numbed. So that's what I mean by moral damage. It's simply this loss of moral sensitivity. You no longer experience anguish and distress where a normal, morally healthy person would experience anguish and distress. So my argument in the first chapter of the book is that this numbing, this moral damage, it happens in war, yes, but it doesn't start there. It starts before that in military training and conditioning. It starts in the preparation for war. Because one of the aims of combat training is, and always has been as far as I know, one of the aims of combat training has been to make soldiers more comfortable with killing people so that they can do it repeatedly and efficiently in battle without succumbing to emotional trauma and collapsing into a heap. So the conditioning might not always work, of course, but that is its aim. Its aim is to allow you to kill people, to use lethal violence without emotional distress, when a morally healthy person would experience distress in these circumstances. So this kind of combat training is morally damaging or even morally injurious, not by accident, but by design. That's the whole point of it, to allow you to participate in the horrors of war without being too horrified by them to continue. So this is surely one of the very significant costs associated with maintaining a military establishment. Whether or not you ever go to war, you've got to continuously recruit people into this institution and then inflict this moral damage on them to prepare them for the eventuality of going to war. I'm not saying anything about whether or not this is justified, all things considered, but it is certainly a cost that we bear.
It's fascinating that it's a fascinating concept, and it's excellent in the way that it's structured for your book. Listeners might know that I was able to sneak a copy and take a look at the book, as I often do with guests. And I'm sure it's no accident, because either you structured the book really, really well or the editor did. But it's excellent in the sense that putting military conditioning and the way that morality is altered for soldiers, in a way. That's how I'm going to phrase it. That might be injurious to our discussion, but I'm going to use it. How their morality is slightly altered from those of non-military professionals to conduct their role. That is an interesting sort of element to have in the back of your mind as you then go through the rest of the discussions in the book, and we'll go through some more questions now, because I just found it an excellent way to set up then asking some questions about things that I wouldn't have thought of, and then when you lead back to altered value sets, then you start to see an interesting way of how all of this can compound. Compounding cost is nowhere near as good as compounding interest. So you also address another issue, which it's rarely discussed in Western liberal democracies. In fact, I did have a book written by someone who now lives in Australia, who failed a coup attempt. I think it was either in was it Africa? Maybe they attempted, but it's called How to Rule the World Almost, I think is the name of the book, and they kind of talk about their own failed coup attempt. And so the topic you talk about is the coup risk, or the risk of a coup. Now, most people in Western liberal democracies don't actually have that in the back of their mind, but it is a risk that's there. And I guess for us, how is the risk of a coup relevant to maintaining large militaries?
So you're right. We don't really think about it, but there have been 400 odd coup attempts globally since the end of the Second World War. Around 230 of those were successful, where the civilian government was unseated, usually by military forces, and that was in 93 different countries. So there's a lot of coups going on, and it would be a mistake to think that this sort of thing only happens in dictatorships where violent power transitions are the norm. The military coup is, in fact, one of the leading causes of the downfall of democratically elected governments. Take some recent examples: the coups in Thailand, in Mali, in Honduras, and there was also the coup attempt in Turkey a few years ago. Of course, not all countries are equally prone to these coup events. The chances are higher in some places than in others. That goes without saying. But whatever the likelihood, the risk is one that all militarized societies bear to some degree. Peter Feaver, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, he called it the civil-military problematique. If you have armed forces that are strong enough to defend the state, then they're strong enough to attack the state as well, and sometimes they will. It's an inherent risk. And Machiavelli actually talks about this a fair bit in The Art of War. It was one of his main arguments for why there shouldn't be a professional warrior class, and why there shouldn't be a group of people who make war fighting their only vocation. So in this respect, if I may come back to the domestic analogy, again, it's like keeping a gun in the home. People arm themselves with firearms to protect their families from intruders, but then sometimes these people end up shooting themselves or their family members with that gun, or a family member gets hold of the gun and shoots someone else in the household. Happens all the time. So in both cases, what you're doing is for the sake of protecting yourself against an outside threat, you create or exacerbate an inside threat. A trade-off is made. And that's one thing that needs to be taken into account when deciding whether or not a military is worth having. One country did think about this sort of thing and decided, you know what, if we don't have a military, then we're in danger, yes. But if we do have a military, then we're in even greater danger because of the coup risk posed by that military. That country is Costa Rica, and it abolished its armed forces in 1948 precisely on the basis of these kinds of considerations. They thought the coup risk was prohibitive, not worth bearing.
It's interesting. I guess the numbers are startling. 400 coup attempts since the Second World War. I'm sure there are not too many listeners out there who actually know that number. And there might be a few people out there who are surprised to hear that Machiavelli wanted less tools for exerting power, but I guess that's there's not too many people who actually read Machiavelli. He was just a kind soul that was quite misunderstood. Now, fear-induced aggression is also an argument you explore in discussing the use of militaries, and I think most of our listeners can kind of understand the idea from the terms, right? It's almost like the preventative war doctrine, I guess. Maybe I'm wrong. Are you able to sort of clarify how fear-induced aggression relates to standing militaries?
You're not wrong. That's exactly right. It is related to the danger of provoking a preventive strike. And this is actually what I talk about in that Canberra Times op-ed that you mentioned a bit earlier. So again, it might be helpful to think about this in terms of the domestic analogy. So suppose you're about to walk into a room that's chock full of really nasty characters. The type of people that won't hesitate to cut your throat just to take your watch or your sneakers or even just for fun.
Yeah, I call it the weekly sync meeting at work. But keep going.
So suppose you're about to walk into this weekly meeting of yours. Now, before you walk in to this gathering where there are all of these homicidal bandits, before you walk in, imagine I offer you a handgun to protect yourself. Should you take it? Should you take the handgun? On the face of it, you might say, of course you should take the handgun. It'll give you the means to rebuff attacks. And perhaps more importantly, if those violent bandits see that you're armed, they're less likely to mess with you in the first place, right? Your handgun will deter them. And so you won't even need to use it. The bandits will focus their attention on someone else that isn't armed, an easier target. But now let's complicate this picture just a little bit. In this room that you're about to walk into, you've got these homicidal bandits that want your watch and your sneakers and your stuff, but you've also got a whole bunch of highly paranoid, violent schizophrenics. They don't want your stuff, but they think everyone's out to get them, and they will, by any means necessary, eliminate the threats that they perceive. Do you still take the gun that I'm offering you? And you have to assume that you have to open carry it, so it's going to be visible to everybody in the room. Suddenly, it's not so clear, right? If you have the gun, the homicidal bandits that want your stuff, they're more likely to leave you alone. But on the other hand, if you have the gun, the paranoid types are more likely to come after you because they're more worried about you than they are worried about the unarmed people in the gathering, since you have the means to harm them. So the world is kind of like this gathering that I've just described. It contains threats, yes, but the threats come in different stripes. It contains both ambitious, greedy states that might want our land and our resources, but it also contains these paranoid types that are more worried about what we might do to them with the military forces that we have amassed. So having a military, yes, it deters the former group, but that comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of potentially provoking the latter group. The important insight here is just this. People assume that if you have a military, your national security can only go in one direction, and that's up. And the bigger your military is, the higher your national security goes. It can't possibly go down. But that's not entirely true. It depends on the dispositions of your adversaries and the makeup of the international community. Are your adversaries motivated more by greed, or are they motivated more by fear and insecurity? That's the all-important question here, and that really determines whether your armed forces deter all potential threats, or whether there's a possibility of your military muscle backfiring and inducing or enticing the very kind of thing that it is meant to forestall, namely a preventive strike.
Well, it's a fascinating concept that by seeking to make yourself more secure, you may in fact be making yourself less secure.
It's kind of international relations 101,
yeah.
But it's kind of taking it to its logical extreme, which is that you're exactly right. The thing that you arm yourself with in order to make yourself more secure is actually the thing that destroys you.
Well, it's going to be a logic problem that's probably going to keep me up all night. So I'm not going to end the show there. We'll go into the other ones, and maybe you can distract me so I can get some sleep. But one of the analogies you use in the book is one that's often used to explain the need to look at problems from different angles with different tools for their solution. In fact, it's an analogy my old man, who was a furniture maker, used to say all the time. But I have a feeling it's because I always just carried a hammer around to bash things with. The analogy is, of course, I've given it away, the one of the hammer. Now, not everyone, I'm sure, has heard of the hammer analogy, although there is a great social media clip of you explaining it, kicking around on the UNSW Canberra social media sites. I know that all the listeners know that they should be following those just to support me and my workplace. So are you able to explain the hammer analogy and how it actually might relate to the concept of cognitive bias and the misuse of military power?
Yes, the law of the hammer, or the law of the instrument, as it's sometimes called, it's captured by this quip: give a small boy a hammer and everything he encounters will look like a nail. So it's referring to this psychological quirk that people have to overuse certain things at their disposal because of unconscious mental heuristics. Basically, if you have a tool, particularly if you've spent a lot of time and money acquiring that tool, you will tend to perceive that tool as suitable for solving all sorts of problems that arise when it might not be suitable. And you wouldn't perceive it to be suitable if you didn't have the tool in your possession. Right? So the law of the instrument refers to this phenomenon whereby the things we have at our disposal tend to distort our perceptions and our appraisal of what is appropriate to use and when. The result is an unconscious inclination to ignore alternatives and to take recourse immediately to the instrument that we have, the things that are available to us and that are tried and true, so to say. Right? So that's the law of the instrument. It doesn't apply to everything that we have at our disposal. Certain kinds of tools are more likely to activate the law of the hammer than others. But the important insight here is that those attributes which tend to activate the law of the hammer, most militaries will have those attributes, and so that will create a proclivity towards overusing them. What that means is that crazy warmongering regimes are not the only ones that are going to overuse their militaries. Even otherwise peaceful democratic governments will sometimes succumb to this psychological bias and overuse the armed forces that we've entrusted them with. It's not necessarily because they're wicked or bloodthirsty or whatever. It's because they're human beings that carry the same psychological biases as the rest of us. And the law of the instrument is not the only bias that has this effect. There are plenty of others that I talk about in the book. The result of all of them combined is this: even governments that are sincerely committed to never waging unjust wars will sometimes wage unjust wars and will misuse their militaries in other ways, because they will mistakenly perceive those wars as just on account of the unconscious biases that distort their thinking. Okay, so this is actually one of the enduring worries about amongst Japan's pacifists. I'm not sure if you follow what's happening over there, but Japan has pacifism written into its constitution, essentially. But the way that the courts have interpreted that has essentially allowed the government to gradually remilitarize the country, and Shinzo Abe is pushing ahead with that. Some of the pacifists in the country are concerned about this, not because they think a military can never be used for good, but rather because they don't trust the government to use the military only for good. They think that there's this inherent risk of overuse. And for them, this risk is prohibitive. It makes a military more trouble than it's worth. Better not to have it at all.
It is interesting, the Japanese concept. I remember being briefed by a Japanese general when I used to wear a uniform about their amphibious capability, and it wasn't quite what we would consider an amphibious capability, but it was all they could do at the time. And it was, the unspoken rule we were all following Abe at the time. And the unspoken rule was they were actually just waiting for some legislation to pass before they can then actually start building up more capability. It's a very interesting sort of case study, the way the Japanese went from having a strong professional military elite. I mean, I guess the ruling class of the shogunate is probably a good example against the coup risk you talked about before, where the military takes power. So I guess listeners get into some Japanese history. Now, the next question kind of ties into that, which is no surprise because I draw my questions from your book. And this kind of ties into the idea of if all you have is a hammer, every problem's a nail, and what we're seeing with militaries being brought into the fight against COVID, the fight against bushfires, is the influence of military on other aspects of life, but also how this can be seen in not just support to the civil populace, which I'm not suggesting is necessary a bad thing. I think there's plenty of people on the in New South Wales, they're glad that there's some support down there on the border, whilst Victoria are going through their second wave of COVID-19. But the military also affects popular culture. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of veterans that are quite tired of the veteran cliche in popular culture. The fitness industry, everyone wants to do a boot camp now. Law enforcement, in particular, our US listeners definitely know about law enforcement being militarized. So I guess how can this be related back to the maintenance of a standing military and I guess their influence in militarizing the non-military aspects of life?
When we talk about the militarization of a society, there are a bunch of different things we might mean by that. One kind of militarization is when the values and the ideals and the assumptions that are associated with the military spill out into the civilian world. And as long as you have a standing military establishment, that sort of thing is very difficult to prevent entirely for reasons that I elaborate on in the book. Now, when this happens, it's not always a bad thing, but sometimes it can have pernicious effects on civilian life and the functioning of civilian institutions. So like you say, law enforcement, police militarization is all the rage right now, particularly in the United States, where basically police start to adopt the mindset of soldiers in war. But I'm currently teaching a course in business ethics, so I'll give you an example from that domain instead to mix it up a bit. You've got Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It's actually become a favorite among business elites. I even found out that some MBA programs even include this ancient military guide in their syllabus, right? So it's a prescribed text. And now there's this whole cottage industry where authors basically take military insights and principles and extrapolate them to commerce. Some of the more serious thinkers in this space have shown that this is a bad idea. It tends to undermine the long-term performance and viability of business enterprises. It's a very complicated story, but here's one element of it to give you a taste. If business is thought of as being relevantly similar to war, then the competition is the enemy. And the objective of business is to vanquish this enemy. There's no way to win other than to destroy the adversary's ability to fight. What the research suggests is that this militarized mental model applied to business leads to bad decision making. In particular, this preoccupation with defeating the adversary tends to make corporate executives blind to integrative or win-win strategies in business that often create more value for their firm than distributive or zero-sum approaches, those that involve gaining at the expense of the competition, right? So if this is right, then the militarization of business, when people in business start to adopt this mental model, it's bad for business. I look at this and other examples in the book, and I try to tell a story about how the process of militarization happens. Why is it that the values and assumptions of the military establishment tend to encroach on and take root in civilian institutions? This can be managed to some degree, but what I try to show is that it's not something that can be easily controlled or prevented entirely. Some of it is going to be inevitable as long as you have a standing army that is functional.
The business thing is fascinating. I remember the rise of the Zaibatsu in Japan in the 1980s, the super financial clique businesses, gave rise to the popularity not just of the Art of War, but another treatise on military thought from North Asia, which was his favourite of mine, the Book of Five Rings, which is written by Miyamoto Musashi, who was mainly a duelist. And having been a lifelong martial artist myself, having read that book, I can see where it's applicable to combat one-on-one, and you can try and extrapolate that to large-scale military combat, but it was hard to do that. But now it's extracted to business world, and I picked up a book once called Principles of the Samurai for Business, and I'll tell you what, there was nothing in there about good faith contracting, which is kind of important for business because you make a lot more money when you collaborate with someone than when you compete. But I kind of get that picture. I guess it's just important for all those people out there in business to understand Ned's response to that question, because you might actually be shortchanging yourself in your business if you're going to war with your clients. Now, I guess we can probably take a bit of a pause now and give our TDP community members, those people who subscribe to our bespoke social network, a chance to listen to a bonus question. And for everyone else who isn't a member of the TDP community, you're a bunch of cheapskates. And we're back. Sorry for calling you all cheapskates. You're all valued listeners, but that was quite a bonus question answer. And if I might say so myself, it was quite a good question. Now, Ned, we're at the final question, which is one that gets asked of all guests who come on this show. And it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. I ask each guest to finish the sentence war is. So, Ned, I ask you to finish the sentence war is.
This is a tough one, Mick. I came up with all sorts of answers to this. I'll say this. War is something that can be justified in principle, but in reality, it almost never is.
I like that. That's good. It's original as well, which is good. I know some listeners, they do, and they probably just fast forward to the end. Fast forward for those listeners under the age of 35 is the old way we used to skip ahead in videos, and a video was a thing. But I guess listening to all the previous ones, we don't generally have ones that are so honest in their, or pragmatic in the way they explain it. We have war as a tragedy, war is something we need to avoid, but never that actually acknowledges both sides of the coin. But I guess you're a philosopher, right? So definitive answers aren't necessarily your thing.
Well, I was tempted to go with the guy that one of the guys that examined my PhD thesis wrote this article where he described war as a competitive slaughter. That was my first inclination to go with that. But
I wonder if we've had that before. That's interesting. I've had similar ones, but competitive slaughter, horrible stuff. But not exactly inaccurate, is it? When it comes down to it, especially when talking about topics like we have this evening. Ned, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's always good to have a guest on. It's always good to have someone who I work with actually say yes and come on the side hustle, because it means that, one, I must be doing something right at work, but also it's just great to have people discussing these big issues coming on the show and letting other people know about some of the material that's out there.
not at all. Thank you, Mick. It's been my pleasure.
Now, ladies and gents, please make sure you check out Ned's book. It's called Ethics, Security and the War Machine, and it'll be in the show notes, a link to Amazon. And just remember, if you buy through Amazon through our links, we get a little bit of coin. We don't take it from Ned, we take it from Amazon. We don't even take it from Ned's publisher. We take it from Amazon, who probably pass the cost down to Ned's publisher. But we don't need to get involved in that debate. That's between OUP and Amazon, but OUP are great friends of the show anyway, so we'll see some more OUP guests coming up pretty soon. Also, just wanted to give a quick shout out. Ned mentioned Mali in his talk before. We have 15 listeners in Mali, so I want to say hi to our 15 listeners in Mali. Absolutely amazed that people are there listening. I am sure you probably downloaded the show by mistake, but 15 is a great number. So thank you very much for that. Ladies and gents, if you want to talk with Ned on social media, you can find him on Twitter at Ned Dobos. That's Ned, spelt like Kelly, at Dobos. Ned Dobos on Twitter. Jump on there and get into an argument with him, because he's a philosopher. They love that. Also, please jump on the TDP community. Jump on the website, www.thedeadprussian.com. Click the TDP community and come hang out with us. Join our writers group. Join our Roman history group. Join our readers group. Give us a book review. Just come hang out with us. It's a closed network, so what you say on there stays in the community. You don't have to worry about getting into arguments with people like I've just encouraged you all to do with Ned. Until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.